Hello plant lovers, and yes, it is time to meet my Phalaenopsis orchids. And as you can see, this beauty is in flower right now, so it seems like the best time to talk about basic care for these extraordinary orchids. Let's start with the name. They are called commonly the moth orchid, and as you can see, it looks like a large tropical moth, and the name is derived from two Greek words, which are phalaena, which means moth, and opsis, which means appearance. So Phalaenopsis, moth-like appearance. That is the literal translation of the name. And there you go. Such an extraordinary flower. Okay, so let's get into Phalaenopsis Care 101. Firstly, I think Phalaenopsis are perhaps the one orchid that everyone has had a go at. Everyone's been given one, perhaps killed one, seen one. I certainly have. So let me tell you my Phalaenopsis story. And in fact, the Phalaenopsis was the first orchid that I ever grew. Okay, so cast your mind back to nearly 20 years, and I was living in New York City, which, as you know, has very cold winters. And one late October, November, I was walking home and I saw someone had dumped on the pile of garbage by the side of the street a Phalaenopsis plant, sans flower, because obviously the flower had died and the person who was given it didn't know what to do with it. So they just left the plant out on the garbage. Now, it would have died because it's so cold in New York, even in October, November, and I just happened to walk past at the right time. I saved it, and I think I've been a Phalaenopsis saver ever since. But by more luck than judgment, I just looked after it really well, and it really was by accident. So in my apartment in New York, the back of the apartment was east facing, so it got morning light. The apartments in New York, as you might know, are incredibly heated in winter, but I'd put it on the kitchen windowsill, which meant that it was close to the glass, which in winter got quite cold. So the Phalaenopsis got both the light and the cold shock it needs in winter to stimulate the flowers, and religiously every year it will bloom for me until in the end it started to get multiple flower spikes as the plant started to age. Okay, let's get to some basics. I am in Melbourne, which I'll show you here, which is a cool temperate climate. But as I grow all these Phalaenopsis indoors, I don't think it particularly matters where I am. And these orchids spend all year indoors, hashtag with one exception, which I'll tell you later on. Firstly, let me say this is not the definitive care instruction for Phalaenopsis. I think everyone has their own version of how to make them thrive and live and flower. So this is what works for me, and it might be very different for you. So I guess the name of the Phalaenopsis game is trial and error. They're generally not expensive to buy, and we'll get to that as well, which means you can experiment and take a few risks and just figure out what is the best way to grow them for yourself. These are all no ID hybrid Phalaenopsis that I've rescued from various places, so there's no particular name. There are also species of Phalaenopsis, and they of course have specific care. That's a different kettle of fish, and I'm sure you'll know what you're doing. First thing then is, these live indoors all the time for me. Second thing is then, let's talk light. Now, I have read that these are an orchid that are fairly low light requiring. I'm here to tell you, plant lovers, that my experience runs counter to that. I have discovered that my Phalaenopsis getting a little bit of gentle morning light, even direct sunlight, but very gentle and in the morning, seems to really benefit them. From that point on though, bright indirect light. Not super bright, so maybe not as bright as an Oncidium, but nonetheless, they're not dark and murky. I give mine more light than I give my Phalaenopsis, which I do think are perhaps the darkest orchids that I grow in terms of their light requirement. Strong, direct light during the day, that will burn the leaves, and I think very dark conditions, the plant will flourish, but it probably won't flower, so you've got to find your happy medium. Next thing, potting. Now, this is contentious. I am going to show you what I've potted this in. It is a glass vessel. I know, plant lovers, I am a terracotta pot kind of guy, but in this case, I'm not. The reason is probably quite a silly one. Whenever I've bought these orchids, they've always been in plastic tubes. In fact, I can show you one. So that is how you'll probably find your Phalaenopsis when it comes from a florist or a grocery store or a hardware store or wherever, in a clear plastic container like that with sphagnum moss. And so as that's how I found them, I just always potted them in sphagnum moss and in a clear container. Now there are two reasons for this. One is that's how I saw, actually there's more than two reasons, but let's not count. So firstly, that's how I always got them. Secondly, Phalaenopsis orchids can photosynthesize to some degree through the roots. Now, Phalaenopsis are epiphytic, so their range starts really in eastern Himalayas, sort of Assam, the northeast of India, all the way across down the Southeast Asian peninsula into the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, and parts of Australia in the north. They do cling to a tree, which means they are used to getting a lot of moisture at one point, absorbing it quickly as it all drains away. So that's kind of important to bear in mind. But it also means that their roots are basically constantly exposed to light, which means they can photosynthesize a little bit. So if you have your Phalaenopsis like this in a glass vessel, it can photosynthesize through the glass, which is a useful thing. The only issue with that is, of course, you cannot have it in direct sun, because if you get direct sun on that, it's going to heat up, it's going to cook the roots, it will all end in tears. Which means you can, of course, pot them in whatever way you wish, whether that is plastic pots, terracotta pots, etc. And again, because I always receive them in sphagnum moss, I just always pot them in sphagnum moss. But this is the only orchid type that I do pot exclusively in sphagnum. And the other advantage of the clear vessel is that you can keep your eye on the sphagnum moss and just see how it's going, that it's not deteriorating, and that you haven't overwatered it, because you don't want it to be soggy at the bottom. So the irony is, of course, there is no drainage in these glass vessels, which means you have to really be careful with your watering. But because you can see what you're doing, you tend not to overwater it. Which brings us to watering. It is, of course, dependent upon the season. In summer, the sphagnum moss is going to dry out quicker, particularly in Melbourne, which is quite a dry heat. And in winter, of course, it's not. So I ease up tremendously in winter. I don't let it dry out completely. And in summer, I water it a little bit more. But generally, I just wait until the surface sphagnum moss is really quite dry to the touch before I water it anymore. And I always make sure that the moss towards the bottom here stays a nice healthy green, not sopping wet, but a nice healthy green. The minute it starts to dry out too far down, then the plant's probably going to start getting stressed and dehydrate, which affects the leaves. Temperature. My experience has been that a change of temperature, a seasonal change of temperature at winter, is important to set the flower spikes. And here in Melbourne, it tends to get chilly at night, and indoors as a houseplant, it seems totally fine, that change of temperature. So these kind of hybrid store-bought Phalaenopsis are pretty seasonal. They do flower, in my experience, once a year, and it tends to be at the same time, which is the flower spike sets in late winter, early spring. The flower spike takes some time to mature, and the flowers then open in late spring, early summer, as this one has done. But you can see our late blooming cousin here. The flower spike is well advanced, and the buds are nice and fat, but they haven't quite opened yet. So this will probably open within a month maybe, which will then be towards the end of summer. All right, I'm going to show you another example now. This baby. Now, these are 3 individual plants, and they were all rescue plants. And as you can see now, it is looking really healthy and fabulous, but it wasn't. These were all used for a display home, and they've been quite strong sun, and they had really dehydrated. See, the old leaves are a little wrinkled, a little leathery, and a little droopy. But the most important thing is that it has produced lots of new vegetative growth, so lots of great new leaves from the top, and a lot of roots. As you can see, the aerial roots are going crazy. So this is looking very healthy, which means I'm hoping next year we should have 3 flower spikes from the 3 plants. Let's talk aerial roots. They are very important in Phalaenopsis, as you can see on this example, which is going crazy. Let them do their thing. They can get really long, like crazy octopus legs. It is photosynthesizing and it is absorbing moisture, so it's very important. Don't cut them off. But throughout the year, you will often get aerial roots developing, which gives you this sense of excitement, as it used to do me, thinking, oh, it's a flower spike. But no, it is in fact an aerial root. And the roots can appear just about anywhere, which is also confusing, because it does appear in exactly the same spot as a flower spike would. I'll come in and show you. So here you can see the single stem of the Phalaenopsis. They are called monopodial, which means they have one stem. So unlike other orchids, they're not going to be sending up new shoots and new growths. They are just going to be growing from the top and sending out new leaves alternately. And you can see it's quite symmetrical. So you have a leaf on one side, then a leaf on the other, then a leaf, then a leaf, then a leaf, then a leaf, then a leaf. And the aerial roots can appear just about anywhere. They can appear in the brackets of the leaf, they can appear from the stem, they can appear from down below, just about anywhere. They usually start as a little nub that is silvery and light green, whereas the flower spikes start and it is purely green. You don't have that sort of silver fluff to them. So that's the way to determine whether you've got flower spikes or roots appearing. That and the time of year. Okay, we're going to look at this baby now and just get a sense of where the flower spike comes from. So you can see you've basically got the stem of the orchid and you have the leaves coming out symmetrically. The flower spike usually appears in this joint in here of the orchid. So where the leaf is coming out of the stem, right in there. However, sometimes it can get a little stuck. And in this case, it's actually growing out through the leaf itself, which is something to watch because the flower can get a bit stuck. And so you might have to help it out. And then we have the flowers themselves, which are beautiful. And I must say these, if you compare them to my hand, are huge this year. It's particularly healthy, I find. And the other great thing about these flowers is that they last a long time on the branch. 2-3 months, so it's great value, which is why you will often see them in flower shops as a cut flower or as a flowering plant, because they're great to give to people because it's generally not going to die that quickly, so you will be able to enjoy the flowers even if you don't know anything about orchids. Fertilizer wise, I give mine a very diluted seaweed based liquid fertilizer. I usually dilute it to at least 1/8 of the recommended dose that's on the bottle, and my experience has been that they don't really have a rest season, so you can ease off with the fertilizer in winter, and I do, but I don't not fertilize it in winter. I know that's not a very clear directive, but if I remember, I will give them a little bit of the seaweed fertilizer, but I certainly start ramping it up and fertilize them much more regularly in late winter when you can see that the buds are starting to form to give it the energy it needs to produce these fabulous flowers. Anywhere in the world, any week, in any shop, you will find a Phalaenopsis in bloom for sale, because growers can force them in terms of the temperature change to produce their flower spikes at any point. Once you've bought one and take it home, it's generally going to revert to its natural flowering cycle, which is the flower spike starts to appear in winter and it starts to bloom either in mid-late spring, early summer, as mine has done now. So it doesn't matter when you buy it and what flower stage it is eventually going to revert back to its natural cycle. But to help it bloom, what I did last year was I actually did leave these outside in autumn for a month. So as the temperature started to drop, I left them outside. They were under protection, so they weren't in direct sun or getting rained on, but I just let them have those extra chilly autumn nights just to stimulate their growth. And it seemed to work. But I think as long as your house temperature does change naturally from season to season, you probably don't need to worry about that. And having them on a windowsill where they do get their cold reflection from the glass is perhaps a great thing, as long as they're not in direct sun. And so the last thing is, where did I get them from? Yes, plant lovers, I'm a cheapskate. Now, with lots of my orchids, I tend to buy them half price when the flower spike is dead or dying because the plant shop or the florist can't sell them. Same with Phalaenopsis. Now, you will see them everywhere, in supermarkets, in petrol stations, in hardware shops, as well as florists and garden centres. And usually when the flower is dead, they are reduced, and that's what I do. I've kind of got a soft spot for rescue Phalaenopsis. I probably have enough now. You've probably seen a myriad of colours, from yellow to red to speckled to magenta, all manner of colours. It also means, because they're relatively inexpensive, and if you're still not sure of your way, then it's not an expensive mistake to make if you don't get it right first time and you end up killing it. So there we are. This is how I look after Phalaenopsis. I'm sure, and I know that everyone else has very different methodology, but it seems to work for me. I find them really easy, low maintenance. And I guess the only other important thing is when you're watering it, don't get water in the crown of the orchid, which when I first bought them, I thought was a great thing to do because it will absorb all the water and create humidity. No, plant lovers, it can lead to crown rot, which is basically a fungal infection, and the orchid starts to rot from the top down, and it's a goner. If you start to see basically blackness appearing in the crown there, you're kind of done and it's time to turf it. Go to a hardware shop and buy another cheap one. But what I do is give them a mist and a spritz every now and then whenever I'm going past, which is probably once a day, just to maintain the humidity around them. The ancestors of these were tropical orchids, although these are now hybridized within an inch of their lives. So they're able to stand our conditions, but that still means they do like a mist, I feel, and a fairly humid environment. So mist it whenever you're going past. Just leave a mister nearby and give it a squirt every morning. And there you go. You should get yourself flowering Phalaenopsis once a year if you follow those basic steps. But as I said, everyone has their own way of growing these orchids. But for me, they are stunning, and it is so dramatic. I mean, it's almost a cliche about how fabulous it is. But anyway, that's why I can't resist them. There we are, plant lovers. Any questions? Oh, I'll try and answer them. But as I said, I've really just stumbled my way through Phalaenopsis from my very first one in New York to these now, where I know a little bit more about them. But it's very dependent on your environment and whether they're indoors, whether you're in a tropical country or whatever it might be. But anyway, they are fairly easy to grow, fairly consistent, and you should give them a good go because they're not expensive to buy. Thank you for watching. Thanks for subscribing if you so desire, and I will look forward to seeing you next week with something else wonderful. In the meantime, take care and enjoy whatever you're growing.